In our last several lectures, we focused on what we tend to do and on what to do and not to do in general in managing conflicts. In this lecture, what we want to do is begin to focus on what to do specifically if we're trying to negotiate a win-win resolution. We've certainly advocated negotiating win-win resolutions. Now we get to begin to talk about how to go about doing that. We want to begin in this lecture with the work of Roger Fisher and William Ury, who developed 4 principles for win-win negotiating. We're going to explain each of the 4 principles, and then we're going to walk through applying those principles with a couple of concrete examples. I want to note as we begin that Fisher and Ury were working at the time with and are still associated with the Harvard Negotiation Project, which is an institute housed at Harvard University. And that institute works diligently with a lot of people, works on a worldwide basis, looking to discover, teach, and then help individuals, organizations, communities, even countries with better ways to resolve conflict. That's their mission. Roger Fisher and William Ury developed these 4 principles working with the Harvard Negotiation Project. So let's talk about the 4 principles, walk through them one at a time. So here they are. Principle number 1. They said what you want to do first is separate people from the problem. Separate people from the problem. That means don't focus on what's wrong with certain people, what's wrong with that person or this person. Focus on events, focus on behaviors, focus on what's happening and why that's a problem. Separate people from the problem. Now, I want you to notice too that they didn't say separate people from the conflict. The people are in the conflict. They said separate people from the problem. It turns out it's much more helpful to talk about the conflict as a problem to resolve, a problem you can resolve together, than to talk about it as a conflict. So, separate people from the problem. If we had a really simple example of that using our roommates, with the one being the graduate student needing to study and the other the working person needing to relax. If I'm Rebecca, the roommate who needs to study, and the noise is happening, I could say, Jane, my roommate, is terribly inconsiderate. That would be connecting the person with the problem, making the person be the problem. On the other hand, if she separates those out, separates what her problem is from Jane, and simply says, I need time to study in quiet here this evening, now she's focusing on the problem and she's got it separate from the person who is Jane. So that's going to be number 1. Separate the person from the problem. Let's go to principle number 2. Second principle, he said, was now that you've got those separated, focus on interests, not positions. Now let me define their terms here. What do they mean interests and what do they mean positions? By interests, what they mean is the reason behind the stand I might take. What am I trying to gain? What am I feeling frustrated about in this conflict? What's the interest behind whatever position I might take? And by position, what they mean is they say, look, people take positions. They take a stand on an issue, and then they negotiate or bargain trying to defend the position. So what they're saying is, look, don't take a position and defend it. Don't focus there. Focus on what's the reason I might want to take that position. What's the interest behind it? Interests are really closely related to the goals that we talked about back in an earlier lecture when Wilmot and Hocker gave us that nice list of 4 different types of goals. What are the interests? And if I'm taking a position, a really good way to think about interest is to ask myself, why is it that I want to take this position? And the answer to that question might really identify my interest. That's what I'm after, and I want to focus on getting my interests met. I also want to focus not just on my own interests, but I want to focus on the other party's interests. Both parties in a conflict have interests they're trying to achieve, and if both parties can focus on their interests and get those articulated and on the table, then we got a shot at really looking for a win-win. Turns out that's going to work a whole lot better than each taking a position and then defending the position and negotiating or bargaining about it. So if we take that one to the point where we're talking about our college roommates, for instance, Rebecca's interest in needing to get the quiet time. The interest behind that is she wants to know the material well to learn it and to get a good grade on the exam. So Rebecca's got an interest she's trying to achieve, and that can be clearly articulated. Conversely, Jane, the other roommate, who works hard, works all day, wants to have friends over back at her home, which is the apartment at night, would very well want to be able to relax, has an interest in being able to use her own environment, her own living room here, to relax and have friends over. So she's got an interest. And if both parties can begin to focus on interests and what both of their interests are, instead of taking positions and bargaining, and instead of connecting the problem to the other, they're going to be able to have a much better chance at getting a win-win. So this would be how we would go forward, looking for that kind of a thing. So second principle then is focus on interests, not positions. So let's go to the third principle. Third principle would be this: generate options for mutual gain. Now I want to spell this out in some fairly clear particulars for you. Most of the time, what we tend to do when we get in a conflict, or even when we're trying to solve a problem, is we want to put up one or two options and then try to choose between just those one or two. And Fisher and Urey are saying, don't do that. They're saying generate multiple options. You really want to come up with more options, several. Get a list on the table to work with. And you really ought to keep in mind that you're suggesting options for mutual gain. What this calls for is the classic activity known as brainstorming. What you want to do when you brainstorm is work together what would get us mutual gain and put a bunch of ideas out there. And you want to be careful, the two of you working together with that, or all of you, if there are multiple sides here, not to criticize the options that are suggested as they're putting up. Humans, it turns out, we're not very good at being critical and creative at the same time. So the classic idea of brainstorming, which really proves out in the research, is throw the ideas out there, get a bunch of them in front of us so that we can consider them. Once they're out there, then let's get critical and begin to consider how best to operate with them. So we're going to generate a list of options, a broad list, by brainstorming together to get a list we can consider to choose between for a win-win solution if we can. Once we've got our list together, now we can turn to principle number 4. Principle number 4 would be this: we want to base the choice we make on some kind of objective criteria. In looking for the objective criteria, we really want to focus on mutual gain. We want to find criteria that reflect the interests that have been identified of both sides in the conflict. And we really want to try to identify measurable, objective ways to assess the value of the suggested options. So we're looking now for measurable criteria to do this. This one can be challenging. Sometimes the debate, the argument, the difficulty happens. This can be difficult, finding criteria that you can agree on. And there's a little pitfall you can run into here, because I might know this criteria will make my interest better reflected, and that criteria would make yours. So you got to be a little careful. There's a pitfall here. But you really want to go look for criteria you can use to judge in this instance, so that you can choose between the options that are there. You may want to choose between combinations of options. In fact, that's more common than not. Okay, that's our 4 principles that Fisher and Urey laid out. Those principles have been applied in communities, in organizations, in individuals' personal conflicts. They've been applied lots and lots of times in all kinds of places since the 1970s, when Fisher and Urey came up with them. They've really withstood the test of time, and they've done that very well. So now let's go and kind of walk through these, applying them to some typical conflicts and see how they work. I described them in the abstract. Let's try to apply them. Let me walk you through a couple of different very typical kinds of conflicts and see how that would play out. Let's start first with, let's say we've got a couple. Let's call them Carlos and Barbara. They're a married couple. And they've got a conflict over taking care of the environment. You may think that one's a little trivial or whatever, but I saw an article not long ago that noted that couples fighting over how to be more green and who's more green is coming up, rising up on the list of things couples fight over. So let's take an example like that. Let's say that Barbara just doesn't think Carlos is green enough. He thinks what he's doing is fine. He's recycling when he thinks of it. He's avoiding plastic if he can help it without being inconvenienced. He's driving a hybrid car. So Carlos thinks that he's nicely green. Barbara, on the other hand, is just like cringing when he leaves the water running when he's rinsing dishes, for instance, or if he stays in the shower too long. And when she finds something that could have gone in the recyclable bin and it's not in the bin, it's in the trash can, that bothers her. So Barbara's not thinking Carlos is green enough. Carlos, of course, thinks Barbara's over the top on this issue, and he doesn't want to be nagged. So what do we do with that? I mean, this is that conflict, as I said. A recent survey said couples fight over this one a lot lately. Let's walk it through the 4 principles. Principle 1. Let's separate Barbara and Carlos from the problem. Let's have it that we're not going to think Carlos doesn't care about the environment or he's just not green enough. And let's not just have it that Barbara is a controlling nag. If the two of them are thinking like that, may be true, but that's not something they're going to negotiate. They can't get anywhere working their way through that one. So what should they be thinking this conflict is about if they want to separate the people from the problem? For Barbara, the problem's going to be they're not doing as well with the environment as they could be or should be. That's her point. Carlos's point is, well, he doesn't want to feel like he's being nagged. He really does like that luxury of the longer shower, and he gets confused about what to put where, and he doesn't want to have to think too hard about it all the time. He doesn't want to have to struggle with this, and he doesn't want to give up the great showers. So if they look at it that way, and that's what their concerns are, they've separated themselves from the problem. Now they've got a couple of problems they can put out there and look at and look for ways to resolve. If they're going to go after that, what they need to do is go to principle number 2 then, wherein what they're going to do is focus on interests. It's pretty clear once they've separated people from the problem in this particular example what the interest would be. Barbara's interest is to use less water and get more stuff in the recycle bin. And that's her interest because she thinks that's more green and she's committed to being more green. An admirable position to take. Carlos really can't quarrel with that. So that's her interest. Carlos's interest is he loves his luxury shower. That's a legitimate luxury. He's a hardworking guy. He wants to keep that. And he doesn't want to have to struggle thinking about what goes where, and he's not always clear about it. So now we've got his interests. So if Barbara phrases her complaint about the problem being with water conservation and recycling, and Carlos phrases his position as, I love that shower, I'm not giving it up, I don't want to give it up, and I'm not clear on what to put where, so I need some help with that. If they phrase it that way, they focus it that way, now they've got something they can work on as a problem they can try to solve together. Now we've got it, we're focused on their interests, not taking positions. We can go to principle number 3, which would be generating options for mutual gain. What will be the question here if we're going to generate options? Put a question in front of us. How can we reduce water usage and get more recyclables in the bin without Carlos sacrificing his shower or having to check every single item before he puts it in the trash or the bin? That's their problem. They can brainstorm to solve this together. What would be some possible options they could come up with? Well, there are actually a lot of them. You could install a more effective water conservation device in the shower head. You could run the dishwasher less often, like every other day instead of every day, and conserve some water. You might change the plants in the yard so they require less water. My wonderful spouse and I did that. We live in Arizona, and it really made a difference. You could purchase items that require less packaging. You join a co-op. There's all kinds of things you could do. You could post a list of the recyclables that Barbara really wants to make sure go in the recycle bin somewhere close so Carlos doesn't have to think about it. We could go on with a list here. They could brainstorm for 20 minutes and come up with a bunch. But the point is there are a lot of things that Carlos and Barbara can do that would conserve more water and make more sure that the recyclables get in the recycle bin without Carlos sacrificing his shower and without having him struggle with what he should put where. So there's a lot of ways that they could do that. So that gets us up to where we can begin to talk about principle number 4. Principle number 4 would be to choose based on objective criteria. They've got some nice criteria built in here, the way they laid out the interests. What's going to save the most water? You can do measurements of what conserves and what uses water and sort that out. What will make it easy for Carlos to notice what should go in the recyclable bin? They can measure that kind of thing. You can really get clear criteria there. And then they could combine some of these options and choose a combination that would really fit. So Carlos and Barbara could work this out. They don't have to nag and push about who's greener. What they can do is combine options and come up with something that's going to work well for both of them, and they're both going to feel good about it. So you see how you can work through those 4 principles that Fisher and Urey give us, 2 people working on a very typical conflict, and get to a better solution if we just go ahead and apply them. Is that what we're most likely to do? No, that's why we have courses like this. That's why Fisher and Urey did their work. But that is what, if we do it, will really help. So we've got advice for Carlos and Barbara. Use those 4 principles. But let's do one more example. Let's do an example that would be in business. That's another place where we have so many conflicts. Let's create a hypothetical example here. Let's say we've got a small to mid-sized organization, give it, say, a $30 million annual budget, 120 or 30 employees, small to mid-sized organization. Let's say we've got a vice president for operations, and the vice president wants to buy a new billing and accounting system. She's just convinced that's going to be more efficient, it's going to reduce errors, it's going to save money in the long run, even though there's an expense of buying it and installing it and getting up to speed on it now. That's what the VP for operations thinks. The accounting department, on the other hand, gets wind of this, and they're into resisting it. They're perfectly okay with the system they've got. They like it. They all feel competent on it. They see a big downside in the time it's going to take to learn a new system, get up to speed on it. There's always bugs to work out when you got a new system, and they just think that the net loss is greater than the gain. They're having none of it, so they're resisting. We got a conflict between the vice president for operations and the accounting office. Seems like a waste of time to the accountants, especially their time. Seems like something we can do to really get more efficient from her point of view. How would we work this conflict out applying the 4 principles? Let's start again with that first one. Separate the people from the problem. We have to say it's not that the vice president is being overbearing or insensitive to the accounting department on this issue. And it's not that the accounting department, that the people anyway, are a bunch of Luddites who just want to resist change because it requires effort. Now, mind you, in lots of organizations, both of those things could be true. But even if they were true, it wouldn't help to deal with the problem to focus there. We have to separate the people from the problem. Doesn't mean the people are innocent. It's just that we can't go after a win-win if the people are going to be seen as the problem. The problem here, the issue should be whether they should, and if so, whether they should get a new accounting system, and if so, would that actually help us gain more efficiency? So if they focus on that, what would gain us more efficiency, and what would be the role of a new accounting system, a new information system in that, that would separate the people from the problem and enable us to focus on the issue. So then we could go to principle number 2. Principle number 2 would be to focus on interests, not positions. The way I described that thing for you up front, the VP had already taken a position. We ought to get a new system. The accounting people had already taken a position and said, no, we want to resist this. This is not a good idea. It's going to be a waste. Now they're at odds with each other. They're not focused on interests. If you go back and remember lecture 3 when we talked about Morton Deutsch and his research, and the focus there is, and an insight there was that people in task-oriented groups have shared goals much more than they have different goals. And the interests actually of the VP and the accounting people, they have a lot of shared interests in this situation. Now, on the one hand, the accounting people really do have a legitimate interest in avoiding unnecessary extra work and avoiding new sources of error that happen when you put in a new system. That's about efficiency. And you know what? The VP has an interest in that as well. So the VP has an interest in more efficiency and at that bottom line and over the long term, and the accounting people actually share that. So when you really look at their interests, they're looking from two different angles. But they have mutual goals and interests here that they could focus on. So if these guys get together and focus on interests rather than being at each other, focused on people or taking positions, they've got a chance to work things out. That would move them up to principle number 3, where what they're going to do is generate options for mutual gain. The question in front of the VP and the accounting people would be this: how can we best maximize efficiency while avoiding new errors and minimizing any unnecessary extra expenses and work? That's the question. Remember, this is generate mutual options for mutual gain, and it's multiple options that we want to do. Now, the new accounting software proposed by the VP is just one option. We shouldn't be laying out one option and just choosing yes or no. That's a mistake. That's an error in decision making. As a matter of fact, Teaching Company has a wonderful course on critical decision making, which helps, and you don't want to set yourself up with one option, choose yes or no if you can avoid it. So they ought to be generating multiple options to deal with this. It's just better decision making, let alone conflict resolution. So you could think of other things. What would they be? Well, there could be new software other than what the VP is proposing that might be less expensive, require less adjustment. There ought to be a range of options there. There are any number of suggestions that could be made aiming at the process or who's doing what and in what order that could focus on increasing efficiency and holding down errors. Better information about the existing error rates and where they come from and where they happen might be something that would be suggested. There are a lot of things that these guys can go and focus on and suggest to get them to the point where they can begin to combine things and make themselves a decision. So that would get them to principle number 4. Principle number 4 is going to be use objective criteria in order to make the choice between these. Again, a clear statement of the interest really helps us focus on objectively what would help. Efficiency is a pretty easy thing to measure. There are a lot of ways to get at it. Person hours, processing time, startup and training costs for any new system. Those things can be projected. Person hours and dollars involved, costs and time involved in debugging. You can really lay out a set of objective measures and begin to choose based on those things. So you can put a set of things together, combination, and the VP and the accounting department really can work out what's probably the best choice if they go ahead and take some time to do it. So if the parties involved in any kind of conflict walk through those 4 principles that Fisher and Urey lay out for us and use that as a way to get at resolving their conflict, they can get much better results. So that's the 4 principles. Now, since developing those, that was a while back, and neither Fisher nor Urey stopped their work. They've devoted the rest of their careers over time to further research and helping people in organizations, communities, even countries apply those principles to resolving conflicts. And the Harvard Negotiation Project continues to be a thriving program, doing lots of research and training and publishing and teaching and interventions and facilitating solutions. That project goes, it's a very thriving concern. There are books that came from this. Fisher and Urey's first book on principled negotiation was called Getting to Yes. It's one of the most widely read books on conflict management ever developed. It's still used in training programs. They've updated with several additional editions. I can remember years ago, my wife and I took a trip through the Grand Canyon on the river. It was a marvelous trip. And there was a young lawyer on the trip with us on these rafts where we're going down the river through the rapids and stuff. And he had a copy of Getting to Yes with him. And he had taken a new job. And before he got to the new job, which was going to start when he got back, he was required to be familiar with this book, Getting to Yes. So that principle's been there a long way. They've done other books and other things since, Getting Past No and a number of others. They also generated some really useful additional ideas that I want to just mention a couple of and talk about them briefly. Two of them in particular to mention will be these. First one would be, there's an acronym, BATNA, BATNA, stands for the best alternative to a negotiated arrangement. Here's what Fisher and Ury suggest about BATNA. What they say is, you know, should you go ahead and negotiate? A good idea to know where your bottom line is, where your power is relative to that issue of negotiating, is to go and think about what would be my best alternative if I don't go negotiate a good arrangement with this other party. What are the alternatives and what's the best alternative? And if I know what that alternative is, then I know how hard I can push, how careful I need to be, whether I need to back off, whether I've got a good alternative really matters. So figure out what your BATNA is, your best alternative to a negotiated arrangement. Really good idea if you're going into a negotiation. It helps you be prepared. My other favorite idea in their book, and there are a lot of them, I'm just giving you my favorites, the ones that seem to work best for me and with the people I work with over time, is what they call negotiation jujitsu. Here's what they mean by that. It comes from martial arts. And the concept here is when someone comes at you, you don't want to push back. You don't want to meet force with force. What you want to do is draw them in and use their own force. Make use of it. So when someone pushes at you with something, they say, look for the interest. Ask questions. Find out what the interest is that they have that's behind their pushing. And once you've discovered that, you can present your interest and make suggestions for mutual gain, how they can get their interest met, helping you get yours. So you're using their push. You're using their own interest to help motivate them to work with you to find a solution. A couple of really nice strategies in negotiation that Fisher and Ury lay out for you, BATNA and negotiation jujitsu. So they did a lot of work after that. Their next book, after Getting to Yes, was Getting Past No. Fisher went on to do another book called Getting Together that we'll talk about when we talk about close personal relationships in a later lecture. These are principles that we can apply in conflicts at any level, personal, organizational, community, even nations. We can apply these at any level wherever they go. And when we apply them, we're much more likely to get win-win resolutions, and the relationships in which we apply them are going to get stronger as we go along. So that's our 4 principles. Let's summarize. What have we learned then in this lecture on Fisher and Ury's principles for win-win negotiation? Principles are these. Separate people from the problem. That's 1. 2 is focus on interests, not positions. Don't take a position and then defend it. Principle 3 would be generate options for mutual gain. Brainstorm, get creative. Generate enough options that you can combine and choose between. And then principle 4, get some objective criteria and agree on them so that you can choose between those options and something that makes sense. We've got some other great ideas from them here, BATNA and negotiation jujitsu. We learned a lot from Fisher and Ury. I think their work really ranks up there, not far behind that of Morton Deutsch and the idea of win-win, because they move us a long way toward how to get win-win resolutions. We can use them with friends, loved ones, companions at work and in our communities. Okay, let me give you an assignment for what to do with this one. Next time you're in a conflict, when you identify what you want, remember our lecture on goals. My goal is the answer to what I want. Move that to thinking about positions. If I would take a position about that goal, ask myself what would be the interest behind that position? If I've got my interest identified, that answers the question, why would I want to achieve that goal, or why would I take that position? With mine identified, let me ask the other person what theirs is, see if we can get theirs identified, and then work for getting interest resolved in that conflict. If you can do that, just give that focus on interest a try, that would be a really good starting point, and you're both going to have a good shot at getting a win-win resolution. Where do we go from here? We've learned these 4 principles for negotiating. Now we're going to move on to a more specific step-by-step process. It's going to involve 7 steps. My version of a step-by-step. There are a lot of step-by-step processes. This is the way I work it. It's a 7-step process, and we'll deal with that in Lecture 11.